Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we dive deep into the stories that shaped America. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our historical journeys. Let's step back in time and discover how these prisoners witnessed the incredible power of the arsenal of democracy and how it changed their lives forever. In the spring of 1943, a convoy of ships sailed into American ports, carrying men who had seen the horrors of the North African desert. These were soldiers of the German Afrika Korps, veterans hardened by sun-scorched sands, blistering battles, and the harsh discipline of the NZI regime. They had been trained to believe in a world ordered by might, a world where victory was claimed through force, where ideology dictated morality, and where the promise of the fatherland was unmatched by any foreign land. To them, America was supposed to be a vast, chaotic, and weak country, a place where men lived in disorder, factories sputtered along at a slow pace, and farmers barely scraped a living from meager fields. They expected a nation on the verge of collapse, a people ill-prepared for the global conflict they had chosen to fight. What they found instead was a shock so profound that it would unsettle every certainty they had carried into the desert. From the moment they stepped off the transport ships and onto American soil, the German POWs were confronted by sights and sounds that contradicted every lesson the Wehrmacht had drilled into them. Cities glimmered under wartime blackouts, streets alive with movement despite rationing, and the air was filled not with scarcity, but with energy and purpose. They saw factories humming with a relentless rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that produced airplanes, tanks, and munitions on a scale that seemed almost fantastical. One of the first things that struck them was the B-24 Liberator bomber plant in Fort Worth, Texas, which could roll out a fully completed bomber every 63 minutes. For men who had watched their own country struggle to equip soldiers adequately, this was nothing short of a revelation. The transformation in these men began not with lectures or pamphlets, but through observation. As they traveled by bus from ports to their assigned camps, they passed farms so vast they dwarfed anything back home in Germany. Fields stretching over hundreds of acres, dotted with barns and silos, fed not only a city, but the war effort, producing more food than entire provinces in Europe. The POWs were struck by the ordinariness of this abundance. American families lived in comfort homes with running water, electric lights, and radios that played popular music across the countryside. This was a people whose prosperity seemed natural, yet it was also organized and productive, a stark contrast to the scarcity, rationing, and propaganda-fed pride they had been taught to admire at home. In those early days, many prisoners tried to reconcile what they saw with their previous beliefs. They whispered in the dim light of train cars, trying to explain away the factories, the fields, the healthy, well-fed workers. This must be temporary, some said. It must be the war effort alone. Yet the scale, the efficiency, and the orderliness of everything they witnessed refused to be rationalized away. Every camp, every city, every train ride reinforced the uncomfortable truth. America was not weak. America was not divided. America was not like Germany, yet in many ways it was stronger than they had imagined. Once inside the camps, the shock deepened. The United States had established over 500 POW camps across the nation, each carefully administered not as a prison, but as a microcosm of society. Prisoners lived in barracks that were clean and warm, received regular meals that often exceeded what German soldiers had in the field, and were provided medical care and recreational activities. Many Americans believed in harsh treatment of enemy combatants, and the NZI indoctrination had convinced these men that they would be met with cruelty. Instead, they found humanity, fairness, and order. The camps were designed to maintain discipline. Yes, but they also offered a glimpse into a society where labor and leisure, obligation and dignity coexisted. The POWs were assigned to work in agricultural and industrial projects. Farms across the Midwest, shorthanded due to the draft, welcomed German prisoners to pick crops, tend animals, and assist in processing the harvest. Factories, eager to maintain production, despite the absence of American workers sent to battle. Overseas, employed POWs in supervised roles. Here, the Germans encountered machines and methods that were beyond anything they had seen in Europe. Assembly lines moved with a precision that defied their experience, and the results were breathtaking. In a single day, American factories could produce more than entire regions of Germany managed in months. The men began to see the truth they had been unwilling to admit. This was a nation of immense capability, a nation whose strength lay not merely in guns or tanks, but in the organization, ingenuity, and energy of its people. The psychological transformation of these prisoners was gradual but profound. Diaries and letters later revealed the quiet astonishment and self-questioning that gripped them. Some wrote about feeling a strange mix of admiration and despair, realizing that the ideology they had fought for was increasingly meaningless against the reality of American society. Others documented private moments of fear that their homeland could never hope to match this scale of production and innovation, fear that their sacrifices had been for a nation built on illusions. By observing, listening, and living in America, they were learning lessons no battlefield victory could have taught. Efficiency, freedom, and dignity could be more powerful than the most disciplined army. Perhaps most striking was the contrast between expectation and reality. And WWII propaganda had painted the United States as a land of chaos, of racial tension, of moral decay. In the small towns and big cities they passed through, German POWs saw order, civility, and a level of social cooperation that confounded them. Factory supervisors treated them with a professionalism that surprised many. Foremen explained tasks patiently, ensuring that work was done correctly and safely. American farmers, some of whom had lost sons to the war, greeted them with pragmatic kindness. The men could not help but notice the difference in attitude, the stark contrast between this openness and the rigid hierarchy of Germany. They began to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. If these people could produce so much with such fairness, what did that say about the principles they had been fighting for? In evenings at the camp, under starlit skies, prisoners shared stories and observations. Some spoke of the scale of American cities, marveling at the lights that pierced the darkness even during wartime blackouts. Others recounted visits to public buildings, theaters, and libraries, places that in Germany had been reserved for elites. They began to see that democracy, in practice, allowed for opportunities and freedoms that even the wealthiest Germans had never enjoyed. Letters smuggled home or later discovered in archives revealed the dawning realization. America's strength was not in intimidation or terror, but in the capabilities and freedoms of its citizens. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it uniform. Some POWs clung stubbornly to ideology, trying to dismiss what they saw as anomalies, convinced that the propaganda must still hold some truth. Yet the cumulative effect of daily life, the cleanliness of the camps, the abundance of food, the fairness of labor, the respect afforded even to prisoners, created a quiet, unstoppable pressure. The mind begins to bend when reality consistently contradicts belief. And for many of these men, reality was America. Perhaps the most remarkable outcome of this experience was the shift in perspective regarding escape and defiance. Only a fraction less than 1% attempted to flee. Unlike the stories of desperate prisoners in Europe, German POWs in America saw little reason to risk their lives. They had access to work, food, medical care, and safety, and they were increasingly aware that their captors were not enemies in the moral sense. The lessons of war were being rewritten, not through guns or propaganda, but through lived experience. Respect for the system, the people, and the nation that hosted them grew quietly but steadily. As months passed, letters and diaries began to reveal deeper changes. Men who had arrived full of hatred and certainty began to question the principles they had been taught. They marveled at the skill of American mechanics, the courage of ordinary citizens maintaining farms and factories while sons and brothers were at war, and the strength of a society that could produce more than entire regions of Europe while sustaining humane treatment for its captives. The camp became, in effect, a classroom in democracy and efficiency, teaching lessons that no officer or pamphlet could convey. Here, in the heart of a nation they had once sought to defeat, German POWs discovered an education more profound than any military training: the undeniable power of an organized, free, and productive society. Even for hardened veterans who had witnessed brutal combat, the sight of America's industrial marvels was enough to shift perceptions fundamentally. The B-24 bomber, the endless assembly lines, the massive grain silos, the tractors plowing, fields larger than their hometowns, these were symbols of a strength that was not built on fear, indoctrination, or conquest, but on human ingenuity, cooperation, and respect. For men who had once believed in the invincibility of the fatherland, America offered a different model of power, one that was tangible, undeniable, and deeply humbling. By the time the first prisoners had spent months in the camps, a quiet but profound transformation had taken root. They were no longer merely captives. They were witnesses to the undeniable reality of a society capable of unparalleled productivity and fairness. And this realization, though silent and often unspoken at first, would have lasting consequences, not just for the prisoners themselves, but for the post-war world they would eventually return to. The stage was set for a story that would unfold not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, persistent rhythm of daily life. Here, amid the clatter of machinery and the hum of industry, in fields stretching beyond imagination, German POWs began to confront a truth that no ideology could suppress. America's greatness was not in conquest, but in creation, not in fear, but in freedom. And in that recognition, the seeds of change for them, for Germany, and for the world were quietly, irreversibly planted. As the seasons changed and months passed, the German prisoners began to settle into the rhythm of camp life. At first, every new assignment, every encounter with American workers seemed almost unreal. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, the extraordinary became ordinary, and ordinary life became a teacher. POWs labored in fields where the soil seemed impossibly fertile, tended to livestock whose health and abundance far surpassed anything back home, and handled machinery that required precision but delivered astonishing results. A simple day's work planting corn or harvesting wheat became a lesson in the scale and efficiency of American agriculture. They watched tractors that could plow multiple acres in a single morning, harvesters that reaped far more than a dozen. Men could manage in Germany. Each machine, each barn, each silo was a testament to a society that could harness human effort to achieve monumental outcomes. At the B-24 bomber plants, the lessons were even more profound. Prisoners assigned to assembly roles witnessed a choreography of industrial might that defied comprehension. The plant moved with a mechanical heartbeat, a rhythm of production that rolled out bomber after bomber, each completed with precision and speed that would have been unimaginable back in Europe. Men who had grown up admiring Germany's engineering, who had been taught to regard their nation's factories as symbols of superiority, were forced to confront a truth that unsettled the deepest foundations of their pride. Here, under the bright lights of the Texas plant, they saw what sheer organization, innovation, and human cooperation could achieve. A bomber in 63 minutes, machines, men, and processes working together flawlessly was a daily miracle. And for the German POWs, it was evidence that ideology and brute force alone were not enough to secure lasting power. Beyond the factories and fields, the prisoners began to see another form of power, the quiet authority of a free, humane society. Camp life was structured, yes, but it was fair. Officers treated men with dignity, medical care was available to all, and the smallest grievances were addressed. At night, the prisoners would sit in groups, some on benches outside barracks, others along fence lines, and share stories of what they had seen and done. Conversations that once revolved solely around war, strategy, and loyalty now included awe, disbelief, and even admiration. Some men wrote in diaries that they felt ashamed to have once despised the Americans they now observed with increasing respect. Others admitted privately that the experience had shaken their faith in the narrative they had been fed for years, that America was decadent, weak, and unworthy of admiration. The POWs were also struck by the kindness they encountered in small, unexpected ways. Farmers who employed them for the harvest didn't just supervise, they talked, joked, and sometimes invited them into their homes. Simple gestures, a hot meal after a long day, a shared laugh, a helping hand eroded suspicion, and hardened beliefs. Men who had been trained to see Americans as enemies, morally inferior and culturally weak, found themselves questioning everything. The humanity extended to them was overwhelming, and for many, it created a cognitive dissonance so intense that it became impossible to ignore. How could a people capable of such generosity also be the enemy? How could a nation that welcomed their labor with dignity be so demonized by propaganda? Even within the camps themselves, the lessons of democracy and freedom became tangible. Prisoners observed rules and procedures that, while strict, were applied consistently and fairly. Disputes were resolved through dialogue, complaints were heard, and punishments were measured and just. In many cases, prisoners compared this to their own experience in the German army, where arbitrary authority, fear, and brutality were common. Slowly, a realization took root. A society built on fairness, respect, and accountability could be stronger than one built on fear and obedience. They were learning lessons that no battlefield could teach, lessons that would later influence their lives long after the war ended. Education was not limited to work and observation. In many camps, the Americans encouraged prisoners to engage in recreational and intellectual activities. Libraries were established, offering books on history, science, literature, and even American culture. POWs attended lectures, discussed political ideas, and sometimes debated issues of governance, ideology, and society. Men who had entered the camps fully indoctrinated with NZI ideology began to encounter alternative perspectives, not through coercion, but through exposure to information and reason. They read about a country where ordinary people could influence government, where labor and industry were balanced with personal freedoms, and where civic responsibility was more than a slogan. These encounters challenged deeply held beliefs, planting seeds of doubt about the system they had been taught to revere. The exposure to American technology and organization continued to be one of the most transformative experiences. Factories were not just efficient, they were humanized. Workers were encouraged to take pride in their labor, to innovate, and to collaborate. POWs saw production lines that seemed impossible to coordinate, yet somehow ran smoothly, producing planes, tanks, and vehicles on a scale that dwarfed Germany's wartime output. The efficiency was not built on terror, but on planning, ingenuity, and respect for the worker. This created an awareness among the prisoners that a society's power was not measured solely in weapons or soldiers, but in its ability to organize, motivate, and sustain its people. Social life outside the camps added another layer to their education. In nearby towns, prisoners observed families managing farms and businesses while supporting the war effort. Children went to school, communities maintained local events, and people lived with a dignity that seemed almost unimaginable to men who had grown up under rationing, propaganda, and the strict hierarchy of Germany. Posts began to note differences, not only in material abundance, but in social cohesion and optimism. There was a vitality, an energy, a sense that people were not just surviving but thriving, even under the shadow of global war. This quiet vitality eroded long-held prejudices and fostered a grudging admiration that, over time, became respect. The transformation extended beyond practical observation. Letters and diaries reveal a profound emotional impact. Men wrote of initial disbelief, turning into awe, then into introspection. Some recorded feelings of guilt for having fought against a nation whose citizens were demonstrating decency, ingenuity, and generosity. Others described a strange sense of hope, a hope that if such a society could exist, a similar future might be possible in their own homeland, should the horrors of war finally end. This was not an immediate or universal change, but it was profound. It represented the beginning of a mental and emotional journey from enemy soldier to witness, from indoctrinated warrior to thoughtful observer. By the middle of 1944, the evidence of America's industrial and societal power had become undeniable. The prisoners could no longer dismiss it as wartime exaggeration or propaganda. They had walked through plants that produced more than Germany could hope to achieve in months, harvested crops that supplied entire cities, and lived in camps administered with fairness and order. They had observed a society that valued freedom, ingenuity, and cooperation, where ordinary citizens played a role in extraordinary productivity. Each day of work, each interaction with Americans, and each observation of efficiency and abundance chipped away at the rigid ideology they had been taught to obey. This transformation, however, was not just intellectual, it was also deeply personal. Prisoners began to see themselves differently, not merely as soldiers caught in a war, but as men capable of thought, reflection, and moral judgment. The experience allowed them to confront uncomfortable truths about the regime they had served, and to consider the possibility of alternative paths for themselves and their nation. In quiet moments, they compared the harsh hierarchy and scarcity of Germany with the abundance, fairness, and energy of American life, and they began to imagine a future shaped not by coercion, but by cooperation and innovation. Even small gestures carry enormous weight. A smile from a farmhand, a patient explanation from a factory foreman, a friendly conversation over lunch, all of these encounters contributed to the re-education of men who had been trained to hate. They learned that strength could be measured, not only in weapons, but in the ability to care for and empower a population. They began to internalize the lesson that a society built on respect, fairness, and ingenuity could achieve far more than one built on fear, coercion, and rigid obedience. By the end of their first year in America, the prisoners had undergone a subtle but undeniable shift. They had witnessed firsthand the machinery, agriculture, and social systems that made America the arsenal of democracy. They had seen cities illuminated despite blackouts, factories producing beyond belief, and communities functioning with order and dignity. And perhaps most importantly, they had seen the humanity of the people around them, an undeniable truth that could not be argued away by ideology or propaganda. Slowly, quietly, the minds of hardened soldiers began to open, and in that opening, the foundation was laid for a transformation that would extend far beyond the war itself. By the second year of captivity, the German POWs had fully settled into their routines. Yet what had once seemed mundane now carried profound significance. A day in the fields, which had initially been a source of suspicion and resentment, became a living lesson in productivity, cooperation, and the power of organized labor. Men who had arrived expecting only discomfort and indignity now found themselves in awe of the systems that allowed ordinary Americans to achieve extraordinary results. They began to notice details they had never considered before: the care taken to rotate crops for sustainability, the attention to livestock health, the precision of machinery maintenance. It was not just production, they were witnessing planning, foresight, and ingenuity at a level their own society had rarely achieved. The POWs also began to experience the unexpected power of dignity and mutual respect. In the camp, relationships between prisoners and guards evolved in subtle but meaningful ways. While the Americans maintained authority, they enforced rules with fairness and consistency, often explaining decisions and listening to grievances. This was in stark contrast to the arbitrary punishments and fear-driven obedience they had known in the German army. Slowly, the prisoners began to internalize a simple but revolutionary idea: authority does not need to breed fear to be effective. Strength could coexist with decency. This revelation was uncomfortable, humbling, and yet strangely liberating. Even more startling were the cultural and intellectual exposures. Many camps established libraries, reading rooms, and discussion groups where prisoners could learn about American history, politics, and literature. Some POWs, who had been trained solely to obey, began to engage with ideas about democracy, rights, and civic responsibility. They read accounts of American innovation, explored philosophies of governance, and considered perspectives previously forbidden to them. These quiet encounters with knowledge were revolutionary because they were voluntary. There was no compulsion, no propaganda leaflets, only the gentle unfolding of ideas. Men who had been soldiers of an authoritarian regime were discovering the value of choice, reflection, and reasoned debate. As the POWs worked alongside American laborers, they began to absorb lessons that went beyond productivity. They observed how cooperation, mutual respect, and shared responsibility fostered efficiency and innovation. In factories, they saw assembly lines that relied not only on machines, but on the initiative of skilled workers, encouraged to improve processes, innovate solutions, and work with pride. In fields, they witnessed farmers managing labor, machinery, and resources with an economy and foresight that amazed them. Each day reinforced a lesson the battlefield could never teach. A society's strength comes not from oppression or fear, but from empowering people to contribute meaningfully to a common purpose. The human element of their captivity played a critical role in reshaping minds. Small acts of kindness left lasting impressions. Farmers who shared meals, guards who offered advice, and communities that treated prisoners with basic decency. All these moments undermined the narrative of cruelty and inferiority they had been fed. Diaries from this period often describe how a friendly gesture or a shared laugh could shake years of indoctrination. One POW recounted how a farmer's daughter, handing him a glass of cold milk after a long day in the sun, made him question everything he had been taught about Americans. He wrote that he had expected hatred and contempt, yet instead found patience and generosity. Such moments, repeated across hundreds of camps, slowly eroded the foundation of fear and mistrust. Even more profound was the effect on morale and ideology. Prisoners began to speak of the incongruity between NZI ideals and the realities they observed. The efficiency, abundance, and fairness of American life could not be reconciled with the lies they had been told about the enemy. Some men admitted privately that they felt ashamed to have fought against a nation that treated even captured soldiers with humanity. Others wrote about the quiet awe inspired by the scale of American industrial production, the cleanliness of cities, and the abundance of food. It was a lesson in humility. The power of a nation did not reside solely in armies and weapons, but in its ability to sustain, organize, and elevate its citizens. Social life outside work further shaped this transformation. POWs were occasionally permitted supervised trips to nearby towns, where they saw families managing homes and businesses, children attending school, and communities maintaining local traditions despite wartime strains. They observed ordinary Americans facing hardships with resilience, yet living with dignity, pride, and optimism. For men accustomed to the rigid hierarchy and scarcity of Germany, this was bewildering and inspiring. They began to grasp that freedom and responsibility were not weaknesses, but sources of enduring strength. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation came in the realm of thought and imagination. POWs who had once defined themselves solely by obedience and combat skill now began to imagine alternatives. They questioned the morality and logic of their previous actions, reconsidered their loyalties, and contemplated futures where human dignity, freedom, and ingenuity guided society. Some even began to envision how these lessons could help rebuild their homeland after the war, planting seeds for a more democratic Germany. Walter Hallstein, who would later become a leading architect of the European Union, is a prime example of a POW whose exposure to American society fundamentally shaped his vision for a peaceful and cooperative Europe. The data on escapes and resistance reflected this transformation concretely. While propaganda and military manuals might have encouraged daring flights or acts of sabotage, reality told a different story. Only 0.6% of German POWs attempted to escape from American camps. The overwhelming majority found life in the United States to be safer, fairer, and more humane than what they had known in Europe or even in the German military. In their diaries, many noted the paradox. They were prisoners, yet they experienced a kind of freedom they had never known before. This internalization of American values through work, observation, and human interaction was far more effective than any propaganda campaign could have been by mid-1945. As the war in Europe came to an end, the transformation of German POWs was evident not only in attitudes but in behavior. Men who had arrived steeped in indoctrination and hostility now expressed gratitude for humane treatment, admiration for American productivity, and curiosity about democratic governance. They had absorbed lessons in efficiency, cooperation, and thought, respect that would influence their post-war lives. Former POWs recounted that the experience of living in America left them with a lasting belief that freedom and responsibility could coexist with productivity and social cohesion. The camp was no longer merely a place of captivity. It had become an unwitting school of democracy and human decency. The impact extended far beyond individual prisoners. Upon returning to Germany, many of these men became advocates for democratic principles, drawing upon the lessons they had learned in America. They applied their understanding of efficiency, fairness, and human dignity to help rebuild a society devastated by war and tyranny. Some assumed positions of influence, shaping policies that promoted democracy, cooperation, and innovation. The experience of being treated with humanity, observing industrial and agricultural marvels, and participating in a functioning society had planted seeds that would bear fruit in a post-war world striving to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. What had begun as a journey of captivity had evolved into an education that no classroom, pamphlet, or lecture could provide. The German POWs had been exposed to the full spectrum of American industrial, social, and moral achievement. They had seen cities lit against wartime blackouts, factories producing planes at unprecedented rates, farms that outpaced European provinces, and communities functioning with fairness and dignity. They had observed authority tempered by justice, cooperation driven by mutual respect, and productivity enhanced by freedom. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it uniform, but it was profound, measurable, and enduring. By the time repatriation began, the prisoners carried with them a wealth of lessons. They had learned that a nation's strength is as much about the human spirit, organization, and social cohesion as it is about weaponry. They had experienced firsthand that humane treatment, fairness, and dignity could convert enemies into allies more effectively than force. They had seen the power of democracy and abundance, not as abstract ideals, but as living, breathing realities in towns, fields, and factories across the United States. These lessons, absorbed during long days of labor and quiet reflection, would go on to shape their lives, their communities, and the rebuilding of post-war Europe. By 1946, as the war in Europe had long ended, the process of repatriating German POWs began. For the men who had spent years in American camps, the thought of returning home was bittersweet. Many carried memories of hardship and uncertainty, yet these memories were intertwined with awe, respect, and profound transformation. They had entered the United States as hardened soldiers, indoctrinated to believe in the supremacy of their homeland and the inferiority of America. They were leaving as witnesses to something far greater, a society that had demonstrated the strength of freedom, the power of cooperation, and the enduring impact of human dignity. The journey home was, for many, a period of reflection. On the ships and trains taking them back to a defeated Germany, men revisited the images that had forever altered their worldview. The endless rows of machinery producing planes and tanks with unerring efficiency, the sweeping fields of the Midwest, teeming with harvests, the illuminated cities that defied wartime darkness, and the Americans who treated them with unexpected kindness. Each memory was a reminder that the strength of a nation did not rest solely on armies or ideology, but on the ability to organize, create, and care for its people. Many wrote letters and diaries during this time, articulating a dawning awareness that the lessons of captivity would influence not just their personal lives, but the rebuilding of their homeland. As they returned to Germany, the transformation they had undergone in the United States became evident in their actions, thoughts, and ambitions. Former POWs brought back new ideas about democracy, labor, governance, and social responsibility. They had seen firsthand how productivity and efficiency could coexist with fairness and freedom, and they sought to apply these principles in a country devastated by war and tyranny. Men who had once been convinced of NZI superiority now became advocates for democratic reform, civic engagement, and reconstruction. The impact of American exposure was tangible. In communities across Germany, former POWs had contributed to building schools, factories, and agricultural programs designed to emulate the balance of productivity and humanity they had witnessed in the United States. One striking aspect of this transformation was the stark contrast between what they had expected and what they had experienced. Indoctrinated to see America as decadent, weak, and morally corrupt, they had instead encountered abundance, order, and decency. Cities that gleamed even under blackout conditions, farms producing more than entire provinces in Germany, factories achieving in days what German industry could not in months. These were not abstractions, but lived realities that reshaped their understanding of power and society. The result was a psychological shift so profound that it would influence Germany for decades, helping shape the post-war European landscape into one that valued democracy, cooperation, and innovation. Beyond practical knowledge, the emotional lessons endured. Former POWs carried with them a deep appreciation for the humanity they had encountered. They had learned that respect, fairness, and kindness could break down hatred and prejudice more effectively than force or propaganda. Letters, diaries, and later interviews revealed that men often spoke of a moral awakening, the realization that a nation's true power lay in the strength, ingenuity, and dignity of its people, rather than in the coercive power of its military, or the rigidity of its ideology. This understanding would guide their decisions, interactions, and leadership roles in the post-war era. The stories of individuals like Walter Holstein exemplify the broader impact. Holstein, who had been a POW in the United States, returned to Germany with new perspectives on governance, cooperation, and international collaboration. He would later play a pivotal role in shaping the European Union, advocating for unity, democracy, and economic stability. He credited much of his understanding of effective governance and the potential for cooperation between nations to his time in American camps, observing firsthand the balance of productivity, fairness, and freedom. Hallstein's trajectory was not unique. Countless former POWs carried lessons from their captivity that informed post-war reconstruction and reconciliation efforts. The POW experience also highlighted the strategic brilliance of humane treatment. The United States, by adhering to the principles of the Geneva Conventions and treating prisoners with dignity, achieved something far greater than containment. It reshaped the minds and hearts of former enemies. Fewer than 1% of POWs attempted escape, a striking contrast to European experiences, reflecting not only safety and comfort, but also an internalized respect for American fairness and order. Humanity proved more powerful than any weapon in undermining the NZI ideology, illustrating a lesson in both morality and strategy. When prisoners are treated with respect, the effects ripple far beyond the immediate conflict. Historians now recognize this program as one of the most effective, though largely forgotten, forms of re-education during World War II. The combination of exposure to American industrial might, humane treatment, and social interaction created conditions where ideological transformation occurred organically. Prisoners were not forced to change their beliefs. They changed them because reality itself contradicted the lies they had been fed. They learned through observation and experience that democracy could work, that productivity could flourish alongside freedom, and that human decency could be a formidable instrument of change. The broader implications of this story are profound. The transformation of German POWs demonstrates the power of lived experience in shaping minds, hearts, and societies. It underscores the idea that victory in war can extend beyond the battlefield. It can be achieved through the demonstration of societal values and human decency. America's victory was not only in tanks or bombs, but in its ability to embody principles that inspired respect and admiration, even among those it had captured as enemies. The lessons learned by these POWs helped lay the foundation for a more democratic, cooperative Europe, shaping policies, institutions, and leadership. In the decades following the war, by the time the last prisoners returned to Germany, a quiet revolution had taken place. Men who had once fought with unquestioning loyalty to an ideology of hate now carried with them the memory of a nation that had achieved greatness through freedom, ingenuity, and human dignity. They had seen the power of a society that could produce beyond imagination, not through coercion, but through collaboration and respect. They had witnessed the moral and practical superiority of a system that valued its citizens as human beings rather than tools of war. These lessons, internalized over months and years, would echo through post-war Europe, influencing generations of leaders, thinkers, and citizens. Ultimately, the story of German POWs in the United States is a testament to the transformative power of experience, observation, and humane treatment. It is a story of how men hardened by war, indoctrinated by propaganda, and trained to hate could be reshaped not by force, but by the undeniable evidence of human ingenuity and decency. It is a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies not only in its industrial might, armies, or weapons, but in the ability to inspire, educate, and uplift not just its citizens, but even those who come as enemies, that the legacy of this forgotten chapter of history endures in the lives of former POWs, in the post-war rebuilding of Germany, and in the broader understanding of how societies can triumph, not only in battle, but in the hearts and minds of those they touch. In witnessing America's industrial marvels, its social cohesion, and its humanity, These men learned lessons that would shape a continent, redefine alliances, and transform enemies into allies. It is a story of awe, of reflection, and ultimately, of hope, the hope that even in the darkest times, exposure to human decency and ingenuity can spark transformation, redemption, and lasting peace.